Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nazir daf Yutet. It's the daf for Shabbat. Today's daf is dedicated to Leiloi Nishmat Hana Bat Rav Shimon, sponsored by her sons, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and all who knew and loved her. We're going to get started with the fourth line on daf Yutet at the top. We've been dealing with is different opinions about when a Nazir becomes impure. At what point do they start their count again? From day 7 of the purification process, day 8, or possibly after they bring, if you remember, the Nazir becomes impure, has to bring sacrifices, possibly after they bring the sin offering, or after they bring the sin and the guilt offering. So now we have a question. We're going to bring a braita, and the question of that braita is Man Tana lahaditanu Rabbanan. Who is the author between which Tana of all those 4 options is the Tana of this braita? Isha shenadra b'nazir, a woman became a Nazir, v'nitme'a, and then she became impure. V'achar kach hefer labala, so she became impure. The commentaries say she even designated the animals ready for the sacrifices, and then her husband came and nullified her vow. Mivi'ah chatata'of, what does she do? She brings the sin offering. Ve'ena mivi'ah olata'of, 2 of the offerings you're supposed to bring are a sin and a guilt offer. A sin offering and a burnt offering brought from birds. So she brings the sin one, but she doesn't bring the Ulla. So who does this go according to? Rav Chisda, Rabbi Yishmael. Rav Chisda says this is Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. Why Rabbi Yishmael? If you remember, the rabbis at the bottom of the previous page said that you don't even need to exclude the Ulla offering because the Ulla offering is just a gift. Well, if the Ulla offering is just a gift, then you should be able to bring it as a voluntary offering. Obviously, the person who thinks that the Ulla is for atonement purposes thinks that this woman doesn't need the Ulla and therefore can't bring it. Okay, and that must be Rabbi Yishmael, who doesn't agree with the rabbis that the Ulla was a gift and agrees that the Ulla is an essential part. Right? The truth is, he didn't actually say the Ulla. He said the Ulla you didn't really need, but he did say that he didn't think the Ulla was a gift. He had a special drasha that taught you why the Ulla does not have to be brought before you already start your count. But he really does think that the Ulla is part of the atonement process. So that obviously would match this braita as opposed to the rabbis who would say you could also bring the Ulla as a voluntary offering. The problem is what doesn't jive here is then why does she bring the chatat? If she can't bring the Ulla, which is for atonement, then why can she bring the chatat, which is also for atonement? So now they're going to ask my kasavar, but we don't really understand his approach. Well, now the question is, this is something we discussed in Nidarim, which is when the husband nullifies the vow, does he do it all the way from the beginning? It's uprooting it as if she was never a Nazir, a Nazirah in this case. Now, if that's the case, then she shouldn't have to bring the chatat ha'of either. She was never a Nazirah. And if you hold that the husband cuts off the vow basically from that moment going forward only, then just like she needs the atonement for the chatat offering, she should also need the atonement of the Ulla offering. So we're a little bit confused. To which the Gemara says, well, really, he uproots it retroactively. But what? Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Elazar the Kapar, the very famous, mentioned him already in the beginning of the Masechet, and he was brought up in Masechet Nidarim as well. You're going to remember anything from Masechet Nazir, it should be this. Maybe also Stam nezirut shloshim yom, which I think at this point you already know. So Rabbi Yishmael must hold like Rabbi Elazar the Kapar, who says, D'Tanya, Rabbi Elazar the Kapar b'Rabbi Yishmael, Ma Talmud lomar. Why does it say in the pasuk v'chiper alav me'asher chata lanefesh? V'chiper ezo nefesh chata zeh. Why did the Nazir sin? This Nazir has to bring, now this verse happens to be talking about a Nazir who did sin. It's talking about a Nazir brings a sin offering when he becomes impure. However, the regular Nazir also brings a sin offering when he finishes his nezirut, when she finishes. So even though the verse doesn't apply across the board, Rabbi Elazar the Kapar is going to understand it across the board. Why? What did the Nazir do wrong? What did he do? It was chata lanefesh. What soul did he sin on? What was his sin? That he forbade himself from drinking wine. anyone who suffers, makes themselves suffer for not drinking wine, that is a sin. So this woman, let's go back to her. Well, she might not have been technically speaking a Nazir because the husband uprooted her vow from the beginning. However, you can't take away the facts. She didn't drink wine for the whole time that she was a Nazir. So she's made herself suffer. For that alone, she gets punished. The continuation of Rabbi Elazar the Kapar is very interesting. The continuation is, and we're just quoting it for the first part, but the continuation is Kal Vachomer, and then we're going to make a Kal Vachomer argument from here. This is just a person who suffered just from not drinking wine, and yet they're called a sinner. If you're going to start fasting, let's say, okay, ascetic behavior, all the more so are you a sinner. And this is where you have his approach to Judaism of saying asceticism is not what we believe in. If you want to learn more about asceticism, you can read Shuli Mishnah's article and flashback about it, Judaism and asceticism and other religions. It's a good read. So now the Gemara is going to ask, but wait a minute. How could you say that this pasuk, Asher Chatal Nefesh, is all Nazirs that are responsible and sin because they didn't drink wine? Nazir Tamikti. That pasuk is talking about, as I said before, a Nazir who becomes impure to dead people. And we're saying it applies also to a Nazir Tahor. To which they say, Kasaval Rabbi Elazar the Kapar, he holds that Nazir Tahor Nami Chotehu. Nazir Tahor is also a sinner. So then why is it written in Nazir Tameh, even though it applies also to a Nazir Tahor, which again, as I said, is explained by the fact that a regular Nazir brings a sin offering. Because a Nazir Tameh is way worse. Why is a Nazir Tameh worse? Because a Nazir Tameh took upon, this is what we've been discussing, took upon to be a Nazir and then had to start all over again. So their whole time period of nezirut was pushed off and extended much longer. So they suffered for a much longer time, and that's even worse. So because of that, the pasuk specifically comes there, but really it applies across the board to all Nazirim, according to Rabbi Elazar the Kapar. Remember, we've already seen, if you remember, and you haven't listened yet, Anita Fee Clymer in her first, right, today we're going to get to her second shiur on Nazir, but in the first shiur that sits on Hadran's site, on second thought, she talks about, is a Nazir a good thing or a bad thing? And we talked about in the beginning of the Masechet as well. Saw the guy with the curly hair, remember? And there's ways to do it. There's ways not to do it. There's some who think it's good. There's some who think it's bad. So here's the approach, thinking that this is a sin. So what we've done so far, to review, we brought a braita, and we wanted to know which of the four opinions that we saw does this correspond to. We said it corresponds to Rabbi Elazar the Kapar because he views the Ulla offering as atonement as well. Why do you bring the sin offering and not the Ulla offering for this woman whose husband annulled her vow when she was impure to a dead person? The reason is because really he uproots it from the beginning, so she's actually not obligated in any of them, but she does have to bring a sin offering for her actions. Not that she was a Nazir, when Nizirah, we canceled that, but the husband canceled that, but she still suffered those weeks or however long she was in Nizirah by not doing things, and for that she is punished. Next, or maybe needs atonement. Now we get to those words in the Mishnah. Let's go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah was on Daf Tetzayin Amud Bet. Someone took upon nezirut while they were in a cemetery. We said they don't bring the korban nezirut, right? For the korban tuma, for being a Nazir tameh, because they were tameh when they took it upon themselves to bring the sacrifice. You actually have to be a Nazir first and then become impure. However, if they went out and came back in, then it says olilo min minyan would be korban tuma. Counts for their days, which we're going to have to figure out. That wording is a little bit strange, and they bring a korban of impurity. So the Gemara says, "Katani olilo min minyan mishum diatsa halal nezirut." Something doesn't jive here. The Gemara is going to say, because you went out. I understand you went out, but you were impure. You can't have tuma apply when take place. You can't have the nezirut take hold when you're impure. So something here doesn't make sense. It says, right, you're only limited minyan, they counted your days, meaning your nezirut started. But how could that be if you just left and went back in? Makes no sense. You're still impure when you go back. Before you left when you went out of the cemetery, you were still impure. To which Amar Shmuel says, no, you missed the point here. You went out, you did the sprinkling, you did it a second time because you do it on day 3 and day 7, the sprinkling of the red heifer waters, and then you went to the mikvah. You went through the process of being pure. Once you became pure, then you went back into the cemetery. Okay, so then Ella Nichnas. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to ask, but wait, something that doesn't make sense. So you were in the cemetery, you said I'm going to be a Nazir. You left the cemetery. You left for 7 days. And then you decided, for whatever reason, we don't know why, it wasn't the smartest thing, but you end up back in the cemetery. Now what it says here is, Nichnas, if you go back in, Hu de'olin lo min minyan. And it says, olin lo min minyan, and you bring the sacrifice. Now what does it mean, olin lo min minyan? Those days count. They count for what? What do you mean they count? They got canceled. As soon as you went back into the cemetery, the days were canceled. And it sounds like because you went back in to the cemetery, that's why they start counting. But lo nichnas in olin lo min minyan. But if you didn't go back into the cemetery, the days wouldn't count. Of course they would count. Something doesn't sound right here. To which the Gemara says lo mebaya. It's a lo mebaya structure. Lo mebaya means we don't state the obvious. The obvious is, of course, if you don't go back into the cemetery, you're going to start counting your days. That's obvious. Then you're mina minyan. But lo mebaya yatsa, obviously, I don't need to tell you, if you left the cemetery, then the nezirut is going to take place. You'll become a Nazir once you finish the 7 days. But elafilu nichnas, but even if you go back in, olin lo min minyan. What do they mean here? Olin lo min minyan. They don't really mean you count these as your days, but the days that you started were counted as days, enough to basically make you required to bring a sacrifice when you become impure, when you go into the cemetery. Obviously, when you leave the cemetery and you become pure, you're going to have to start your days all over. So now Rav Kahana Rav Asi, after Shmuel explained the Mishna in this way, that it means you went out and you didn't go out and come right back in. You went out and waited for 7 days and then came back in after you're purified. So Kahana Rav Asi said to Rav, my time alone fresh at lang ta'alem mile. Why don't you explain it the way Shmuel did? I don't understand. So Amar Lahon Amina Domalot Tzrachitu. I didn't realize I needed to. I thought that was obvious. I thought it was clear. Obviously, you don't go out and right back in. That wouldn't, obviously, you would be still impure. It wouldn't make a difference. So I didn't think I needed to state the obvious. This is a classic example of a teacher, that things are so obvious to the teacher, but the students don't always know that. And you have to be always careful as a teacher to make sure that you're explaining the things that people might not necessarily, that are so obvious to you, but might not be to other people. Okay, so far we did one braita. We said, who's the author of that braita about the woman whose husband nullifies her vow? With that, we got into the 2 possibilities of how the husband undoes the vows, annuls the vows of the wife. Is it me'aker? Is it got megas gayis, right? Does it go all the way back from the beginning? Or is it cut off from that moment? We said, really, it's from the beginning. And we said then, so why does she still bring the sin offering? We said he must hold like Rabbi Elazar the Kapar. So we connected that with Rabbi Yishmael. Also, I forgot to mention, we mentioned it with Rabbi Yishmael's opinion about the way he perceives the Ulla as it was for atonement, and that's why it can't be brought as a voluntary offering. Then we tried to deal with the wording in the Mishnah. What is this? Number 1, how do you go right back into the cemetery? No, that's not what it meant. And number 2, what are these words? What is if it's not, if you don't go back in to the cemetery? But obviously that was clear, and this was less clear, so they had to point out what was less clear. And then we asked Rav, why didn't you explain the Mishnah the way Shmuel did? And he said, I thought it was obvious. Next, Rabbi Elazar Lo bo bayom. If you went out, you'd have to go with Shmuel, became pure again. And the day you become pure, you go right back into the cemetery. Then it doesn't work. Meaning you don't have to bring the sacrifices for impurities. Why? It says on the first day's drop, there have to be first days. And there isn't first days in this case. It was just 1 day. So that we already learned in the Mishnah. Now we're going to have Ulla's interpretation. Amar Ulla. Lo amar Rabbi Eliezer ele b'tamei nazal. Rabbi Eliezer said this only about a person who took upon their nezirut, the exact case in our Mishnah, when they were impure, like, for example, in the cemetery. Aval b'nazir tahol shenitma. But if it was a nazir who was perfectly I took on nezirut in a regular way, the way we've always been talking. And then that day I became impure. Afilu yom echad soter. Rabbi Eliezer would agree with the rabbis in that case that I would have to bring a set of korbanot and I would be a regular Nazir to hold. Where does he get this from? Good question. We're going to have two things. Number one, where does he get it from? Number two, Abaye is going to raise a question against Ulla, and basically we're not going to have an answer to it. And he's going to bring a braita that seems clearly to go against the way Ulla understands Rabbi Eliezer. So Amara, my time is Rabbi Eliezer. So Rava says, I'm going to explain Rabbi Eliezer the way that Ulla just did, based on a pasuk. Amarcha. The pasuk there, when it talks about Yamim Arishonim Yiplu, those first days basically get dropped and you have to start again. It says in that pasuk, Ki tamei nizro. Okay, basically it says Yamim Arishonim Yiplu, those days will fall because you made impure your nezirut. Now, the literal is you had a nezirut that was good and you made it impure. But tamei nizro is going to be darshan to say you became a nazir when you were tamei. When you become a nazir when you're tamei, then you need the yamim, the plural, the two. Okay, that's the way Rava understands the source for why Ulla thinks that Rabbi Eliezer says it's just in that case. Hey, Abaye. Abaye is going to raise a question against Ulla from a braita. Helene Nazir me'ayom. Okay, there's going to be three parts of this braita. Only the first one is relevant to us, but we're going to read the whole thing. If I say I'm going to be a nazir for 100 days, v'nitma b'tchilat mea, and then on the first day I become impure, yachol yehe soter, you would think that it would knock out the day. Talmud lomal, but it says in the pasuk, hayamim arishonim yiplu, which means the first days to which they say, ad shiur yamim rishonim, you need to have days before you became impure, and you got impure on the first day, so it's not canceled. V'zeh ein lo rishonim. In this case, you don't have rishonim, so number one, days aren't canceled. I guess it counts. You have one day of nezirut, and you don't have to bring, when you get out of your impurity status, you don't have to bring the sacrifices. So here you see, this is even in a case, there's a regular case where you were pure and then you became impure. That's clear from here. We'll see that in the Gemara in a minute. Second case, nitma b'sof mea. Again, these cases aren't relevant for our purposes, but you became impure at the end of the 100 days, on day 100. Yachol yehe soter, you might have thought it cancels all the days. Now, why do you get it from the first day's drop? Where do you get it from there? Well, why do they call them the first days? The first days mean there must be last days. And in this case, you're in the last day. There are no days after it. So that means they don't cancel it out either. But if you're becoming pure on day 99, you might have thought, just like day 100, you don't cancel all the days. Maybe also you don't hear. From here you learn what? There's first days and last days. And in this case, you both have first days and you have last days because you're done day 99, which means you still have part of 99 left and you have day 100 left. So that means 2 days are still left. Therefore, this is going to apply that Yamim Rishonim Yiplu. You're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning. That's the end of the braita. Now the Gemara says, what was the purpose of bringing this? To knock out Ulla. Ulla, who said that Rabbi Eliezer only holds that if the requirement of days before you become impure that you need to bring a sacrifice are only days if you were Nazir that became impure, but not regular impurity, where you took upon nezirut and then became impure. Then even on day number 1, it would be fine. Well, this source clearly doesn't seem to think that way. In a tamei shenazal, right, a person who was impure who became a Nazir while they were impure, lo matzid amart, you can't say it's talking about that in this braita, because midikatane hareini nazir mea says you said I'm going to be a Nazir for 100 days, v'nitma b'tchilat mea, and then right after that you became impure. Obviously, you weren't impure to begin with, otherwise your Nazir wouldn't have even started yet. V'katane, and what does it say? Actually, yamim rishonim. It says you need days before tiyuvta. This is an actual knockout of Ulla's approach. So in this section, right, after we saw, number 1, who the braita was according to, that first one, and we connected it to Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Elazar the Kapar, then we tried to understand Tanakama and the Mishna of the wording, what it means, yatsav, and you went back in, you must have gone back in after 7 days, and olila min minyan means, doesn't mean it's part of your count, it just means that your nezirut started, and therefore you now became impure, and you'd have to bring the sacrifice. And then we have Rabbi Eliezer, and Ulla said, He's only talking about the case in our Mishna, not a regular case of nezirut, and the Gemara basically rejected it. Abaye rejected. Now, Amalei Rav Papa Abaye. We have one more section and then a new Mishna, and then one little question on that, one little issue on that Mishna. Rav Papa says to Abaye, is it, when you say 2 days, what do you mean by 2 days? 2 days can mean, you mean 1 day finished, and you started the second one, you're already kind of into the second day, that's 2 days. Or does it mean 2 have to pass, and then you became impure on the 3rd day? This is a classic, you never know exactly how to count things. Lo hava biyadeh. Rav Papa asked Abaye this question, Abaye didn't know how to answer. So he went to ask Rava. Amar lei. We talked about Rav before of not saying something that was so obvious to him, but wasn't obvious to other people. Here's another good example. Amar lei yiplu ktiv. So he answers him back. It says yiplu. From there, it's obvious. Obvious what? Good question. So our Gemara and the version that we have seems to indicate, although there's a bit of a lack of clarity here. The Rosh basically, the Rosh and Tosfot say yiplu means 2, means you only need up to and including 2. In other words, into the second day is sufficient, because yiplu seems to indicate, right, those days fall out. Again, it's not so clear how, and that's why the interpretations go in both ways. Sounds like yiplu, anyway they fall, okay, which could be any part of 2 days. But the Rambam and others say it actually is the reverse. It actually shows you need 3. Okay, why? It's not so clear, and the continuation of the Gemara doesn't work so well according to that interpretation. Anyway, we'll stick with the one that says yiplu means 2. And now we're going to read v'itzrich lemichtav yamin, v'itzrich lemichtav yiplu. Now, theoretically, from yamin you could learn 2. So why do you have yiplu, which is plural, which also means 2? Why do you have both? If you only had yamin v'lo yiplu and you didn't have yiplu, hava amina, you would have thought adinab kintreva aylin tata. You might have thought yamin means full days. You would need 2 days to pass and only in the 3rd day. Therefore, katar brachmana yiplu. This, by the way, obviously supports the reading that we have, which is, that's why it says yiplu to say it's not 3, it's only 2. The katar brachmana yiplu, so why don't you just have yiplu then? And then it would be obvious. You mean up to and including 2. And you didn't have yamin, what would I have thought? Hava amina afilu chad. You might have thought yiplu is not specifically. If you said, right, the days fall, you just said fall, you would have thought fall could mean, yes, it's plural, but it could, most of the time it's going to be multiple, but maybe it's not specifically, maybe if it happened also on the first day, it would be the case also. Therefore, katar brachmana yamin. The fact that you have yamin and yiplu comes to convince you that this is specifically saying you need a minimum of days. Obviously, not everyone agrees with this because this is only Rabbi Eliezer's approach, but we're within Rabbi Eliezer explaining his approach. Okay, so that was a discussion. Whether it's 2 or 3, it seems to be siding, at least the way we read the Gemara, on 2, including the second day. So if you get impure on the second day, again, what is this for? You'd already have to bring the sacrifices for impurity. If it was less than that, you wouldn't bring sacrifices. You would have to wait the days before you went back to your nezirut, but you wouldn't need to bring the sacrifices and the shaving. Okay, so that was the next section. So again, just a quick review. Braita was the author of the braita. Then we had the wording of the Mishna, Yatsav and Ichnas, what we mean by that, and Mina Minyan. Then we have Rabbi Eliezer. We had Ulla's interpretation that was only in someone who became a Nazir when they were impure. Then we rejected Ulla. Abaye rejects it. Then Rav Papa asked this question, do we mean 2 or do we mean 3? We answered 2. Now we have a new Mishna. Misha Nazar nezirut harbe. Somebody who took on nezirut for a long time. The next thing you're going to learn is they were outside of Israel. Now, outside of Israel, the rabbis determined that we're going to make all of outside of Israel impure. There's a rabbinic decree to say there's impurity of the dead everywhere outside of Israel. We're not going to get into all the reasons why and all that, but it's a rabbinic decree. So now, if you took on nezirut for a long time and you were outside of Israel, meaning more than 30 days, and you finished it, and you came to Israel to bring your sacrifices. Beit Shamai omrim Nazir 30 yom. Beit Hillel omrim Nazir b'tchila. Beit Shamai says you have to be a Nazir for 30 days. That's it. You just have to make up a nezirut because you were a Nazir, theoretically, you were tamei there. Again, rabbinic ordinance, but you were tamei by rabbinic law. 2 of dead bodies, so you have to redo it, but only 30 days. Beit Hillel is actually strict here. Omrim Nazir b'tchila. You have to go back to the very beginning. So if you took on for a year, you have to be a Nazir for a year when you get to Israel. Ma'aseh Helene Amalka. Case with Helene the Queen. If you want to learn more about her, you can listen to On Second Thought this week of Rabbanit Yafi Climber. Talks all about Helene Hamalka. Shalach bena le'melchama. Someone out to war. She was outside of Israel. She said, if my son comes back healthy from war, I'm going to be in Nazirah for 7 years. He comes back safely, right? You can imagine the scenario. She wants to make a vow, right, to God to kind of protect him. Anyway, he comes back. So she was in Nazirah for 7 years. Comes the end of her nezirut. She comes on Aliyah. She comes to bring her sacrifices. Beit Hillel says you need to do another 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, guess what happened? Nitmet, she became impure. Oh my God. She now has to do nezirut. This woman was 21 years in Nazirah. All she did was take on 7 years. It turned into 21. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, which we're not yet going to understand. The Gemara, we'll get to this later. Lo hayta Nazirah el 14 shana. So we got the story wrong. She was only in Nazirah for 14 years. Now the Gemara is going to say, Hatane reisha Beit Shamai omrim Nazir 30 yom, uBeit Hillel omrim Nazir b'tchila. So now we want to understand what's the root of this machloket, 30 days or the whole time period. Lema b'haka mifliyah. Let's suggest this is the machloket. The Beit Shamai savrei eretz ha'amim mishum gusha gaswaleh. Going now into the next page for a second, Beit Hillel savrei mishum avira gaswaleh. There's a machloket about whether Eretz Ha'amim, the gzera of the rabbis, was more lenient in scope, which was just if you touch the ground or the dirt, then that's Beit Shamai. They were more lenient, so therefore they were going to be more lenient about making you make up your nezirut. Whereas Beit Hillel said just being in the airspace of Eretz Ha'amim, of other countries, is mitame, and therefore they were strict, and therefore they made you redo your entire nezirut from the beginning. There are different ways of reading this, and some versions have it the opposite, and then you have to explain it in some other way. We're going to end here, wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.